Doesn't matter anyway. I don't even care what anybody thinks anymore.
Well, for what it's worth, I think it took a lot of guts to do what you did back there.
So here's the thing about Diane and Bojack from Bojack Horseman. Their relationship throughout the series goes through insanely high peaks and terribly low valleys. There are times when they're able to connect on a really deep and spiritual level. True, but there are even more times where the friction between them becomes too much and erupts into a major falling out, to which they have many. Their relationship is also one of the most central of the entire show. Of all the main cast that Bojack interacts with, I'd argue that his closest relationship, or at least most important in the context of the plot of the show, is Diane. He is always searching for her approval and needs to know that she is okay with everything he's done and accepts him for who he is. Despite that, their relationship is extremely bumpy, and at the end of the series is pretty much deemed as over. So why is it that Diane and Bojack were always at odds with one another despite their best intentions and always being paired together? Well, the first reason is their similarities. Honestly, they are two sides of the same coin. I mean, Diane outwardly states this multiple times over the course of the show.
You know, I think we're alike in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's funny. I always tell people you're like the not cool version of me.
Although they present themselves very differently, they both share an extremely low sense of self-worth. Being raised in houses where they were actively shunned, they grew into incredibly insecure adults that constantly need validation from others. And when they're together, their negative traits, like their self-loathing and wallowing, tend to play off of each other and create some sort of emotional feedback loop between the two of them. They both create negative energy, so when they're around each other, it kind of just multiplies. They just get progressively worse and worse the more they're around each other. We can see this happen in season 2 when Diane stays with Bojack after leaving Cordovia, and again in season 5 when Diane stays at Bojack's place after divorcing Mr. Peanut Butter. And when they're in this state, they both honestly destroy everything good that the other has going for them, which I think leads to a lot of underlying resentment and bitterness between the two of them. I mean, Diane forces a wedge in between Bojack and Wanda. Granted, Bojack generally blames himself for that, but I definitely could see how Diane strained the relationship to a point where they both had to end it. Not exactly entirely her fault, but it sure played a part. And then Bojack latches on to Diane and then sinks them both further down, encouraging her to stay with him and lie to her husband, enabling her negative behavior. Whenever they're together, there's always a lot of drinking involved. I don't know if you noticed that, but they play off of each other in a really awful way that I kind of was just hoping they would not talk to each other, especially in season 6 when they were both doing better. I was glad to see that they could positively interact, but again, that kind of friction would only come up again later when they differed on Bojack's past transgressions. Plus, think about it like this. If they both hate themselves and they're similar, how are they going to like the other one? And I think that's why Bojack bothers Diane so much, specifically. When he says they're the same, it really gets to her because she doesn't want to be that person, but she knows that Bojack does have a bit of a point, and that's why she lashes out. More on this in a little bit. Now, there are a few examples of these working in their favor. Diane understanding Bojack's struggles so deeply is a big reason why she was the one who was finally able to get him to therapy. She knew just how hard to press to get him to take her point and move forward with his life. But overall, most of the influence they have on each other ends up becoming friction because of how similar they are and how little they like themselves. Another reason is Diane's rashness. I believe I discussed this during my video essay on solely her character, but she has a rather rash and quick-moving personality. She doesn't always think her actions through before moving forward with them, leaking her unapproved book to the press, going after Hank Hippopopoulos, telling Bojack that he's going to be alone when he commits suicide. I mean, what the fuck? Writing a slam piece about Mr. Peanut Butter, writing New Mexico into Filbert. There's a lot of examples of her going rogue and ignoring everyone around her to do what she feels is best. And these actions almost always separate her from the people she's closest to, though. Bojack genuinely confesses to her that what she did with his book hurt his feelings. She made him look like a fool. And as she was correct that it did paint him in a sympathetic light, she still did definitely play up the humor of the character of Bojack. Then when Bojack complained about it, she kind of ignored him. He kind of had to drag an apology out of her later. Bojack was out of line there for sure, but I think Diane not considering other people's feelings and moving ahead with what she wants is a big reason for this friction between her and Bojack. She damages a lot of her relationships fundamentally by doing these really rash actions, whether it's Bojack or Mr. Peanut Butter. But in this case, there are quite a few examples of Diane doing something just spiteful to Bojack that permanently changes their relationship. Now, it's not just her, I'll get on Bojack in a minute. The biggest example of this, though, I think is an int sub. I don't think they were ever really friends again after this. When Bojack lies to her about New Mexico, instead of directly confronting him about it, she decides to write a slightly paraphrased situation into an internationally broadcast television show. I love Diane, but what are you thinking? How would that get Bojack to learn anything? That is only going to piss him off or make him feel extremely depressed, and neither of those things would be good for Bojack's recovery. And it does make things extremely awkward between them until they finally explode in Head in the Clouds. What Diane does really only adds fuel to the fire. It's the same reason Bojack fired her and led to his drug-fueled begging for approval scene at her ghostwriter panel. She just moves too quickly, and no one's emotions have time to catch up with her. Another reason, though, is Bojack's cluelessness. Listen, as annoying as it is when Diane does these things, you can always see where she's coming from. But Bojack's lack of self-awareness is incredibly frustrating, and I let it get to me just as often as she did. It specifically comments like, "I'm not someone therapy works on, I might be too smart," that really pisses people off and makes Diane want to do those rash things. He has such an ego about him, covering up that low self-esteem, it's hard to pierce through and get to logical reasoning. Whereas Diane is always playing against herself, Bojack presents confidence but doesn't actually have it. Like with the book in season 1 too. Diane tries to tell Bojack that he was written to be sympathetic, but as PC puts it, Diane can say 10 nice things and 1 mean thing, but Bojack will only hear the 1 mean thing. He's only going to take those negative bits of information and throw back anger, not really understanding that Diane is trying to help him in a big way, which the book does end up doing. I mean, he gets a freaking Golden Globe for it, and Diane never gets apologized to, but she is forced to apologize to Bojack for releasing the book early. I think there is a little bit of a discrepancy there. She tries to get him to admit that he's done wrong and accept that he needs help, but he continually refuses to see it, saying that he can take care of himself, or it wouldn't work, or that it's a waste of time. Once he's done something wrong, his opinion of himself sinks even lower, and he moves further away from actually believing he can be helped. He was fine talking to Dr. Indira when she was just a friend, but as soon as it's therapy, he flees the room because then he'd have to admit that something is wrong with him and it needs to be fixed. And Diane gave up her whole ass therapist for him to just leave in 5 seconds. I mean, that really pissed me off. I mean, Int Sub is really just a disaster episode where Bojack and Diane do incredibly rude and toxic things to each other. I hate it. Or when Diane comes to check on him after the Oscar nomination comes out, she was only trying to be kind and care for him, knowing that he could sometimes spiral out of control, even from good news like this. But Bojack simply refuses to say that anything is wrong, instead indulging further in his vapid party nature, surrounding himself with complete strangers. And that's why Diane resorts to tell him something so extreme, because she's trying to get through this party confident Bojack that is sucking up to people he doesn't actually care about. Or how about when Diane tries to teach Bojack about feminism and he's just straight up incapable of learning anything? She tries over and over again to teach him to be better, but he only listens about 1% of the time. And then he wants her to fix him. So confusing, but wonderfully complex. Another reason is the lack of honesty between the two of them. I mean, they don't tell each other anything. It's honestly infuriating how little they they talk to each other about their lives except when there's a total crisis. Bojack literally sees Diane right after New Mexico and doesn't even mention where he went. Buddy, think that might be why she was so offended when you didn't tell her. Same thing when he was back in LA after returning from Michigan. He values Diane's opinion so highly, he didn't want her to see him not fully improved. But keeping that secret from her hurt their relationship overall. Two sides of the same coin again, though, because Diane also hides things from Bojack. I don't think it exactly would have been a breach of ethics for her to disclose to him exactly what she was writing in his book, or at least how she was going to portray him. But correct me if I'm wrong. She doesn't really tell him why she's staying with him or what happened in Cordovia until he kind of directly asks and pulls it out of her. She kind of just crashes and definitely overstays her welcome. She never told him about what horsing around meant to her as a kid until she really needed to lift him up. She doesn't confront him about what happened in New Mexico until it comes out in an extremely underhanded way and slowly damages their relationship by being distant instead. And then she also doesn't really reach out to him when she's suffering through her severe bouts of depression in season 6. She knows he would understand too. He doesn't find out until he directly comes to visit her. There's other moments like Bojack not willing to tell her about what's going on with his feelings about his mom. I mean, come on, just be honest with each other and this relationship would have been so much easier. They really only tell each other stuff at crucial moments, like Bojack calling Diane for help in View from Halfway Down. But because they're only seeing each other at their respective worsts, they keep getting skewed views of the other person's character. Nothing is really talked about until it boils over or until it's absolutely necessary. And those gaps in knowledge really affect their opinions of each other, as well as, of course, breaking their trust and friendship since they're constantly hiding things. And another reason is they get too close to each other. Professional boundaries? What are those? We don't really know how to maintain those when we're in Bojack Horseman and Diane Nguyen. They entered each other's lives through work, but they slowly become closer and closer to each other and involve themselves more and more in their personal lives, despite the fact that there really needed to be some harsh distance between them considering how much information Diane is learning to write this book for him. I mean, if Diane is going to learn how similar Bojack can be to her and how unfair his family was, just like hers, I think she might have wanted to keep a little bit of distance, which she did, to be fair, try to do, but it still kind of petered out very quickly. There are so many mistakes made on both sides and how to interact with your ghostwriter or your subject matter, flirting with one another, involving themselves in personal issues that the other person is going through, leaning on the other when going through their own crisis. It's just all extremely unhealthy for a business relationship. That's how they were introduced. I mean, technically they met at the Halloween party, but I mean, he didn't even remember that. And they continue to work together over and over again too, right? Like the ghostwriting thing stops in season 1, obviously. And for good reason. I mean, Bojack fires her, they go to Pinky's, and then they have some huge blowout, and it's like, okay, if it was going to end like this, you guys should definitely not be working together. But they do again, over and over again. She works on the Secretariat movie. She works for Princess Carolyn's agency. Again, for the Bojack Hills episode, when they were together too much, it hurt her personal relationship. Not only are they too close personally, they also just kind of like mix their personal and professional lives together, like Diane being spiteful through Filbert, which is really only a recipe for disaster. I mean, that just cannot go well. And the last reason is that they had differing expectations for what the relationship was. I think Bojack wanted Diane to save him, or fix him, absolve him. From the very beginning, Bojack latches onto her, immediately trying to start something romantic and get as close to her as possible, despite the boundaries that she tries to set. He views her as this, like, wise sage that will guide him through all of his sins and earn forgiveness for him, or directly teach him how to earn it. That's why he begs for her to tell him that he's good. He values her opinion so highly and sees her as the only person that can deem him as good or normal. And without her to guide him, he backslides. Mostly because he doesn't want the responsibility of working on himself. He wants to outsource that to someone else and use them as a sort of crutch. That way, he doesn't have himself to blame when something bad happens. Or does something extremely toxic to push her away so he can blame it on that thing and not himself. Again, I'm being pretty harsh on old Boj, but it's definitely true. He does the same with Todd and PC, and he gloms onto them, and he hopes that they'll lift him out of whatever rut he's in. PC gets out of it quite quickly in the early seasons of the show, thank God. But personally, I think he does this the most with Diane. And this is not a taking sides video. I think it's equal on both parts. And this sentiment doesn't really entirely change either. In season 5, when she divorces Mr. Mr. Peanut Butter, Bojack seems to have a renewed interest in a romantic relationship with her. Maybe I'm misreading. I know a lot of people don't think he was necessarily romantically interested when they were kind of drinking together or when he invited her to Mr. Peanut Butter's party, but I personally saw it as him kind of backsliding into he's trying to be better. He thinks Diane is the model for that, so he wants to get as close to her as possible. And again, because Diane is going through something of her own, she kind of lashes out a little bit because she's uncomfortable with that closeness, and then they get in a fight. I think he definitely doesn't push as hard as he did in season 1 though, which I respect him for, but he still expects Diane to be the one to save him, evidenced by the call in View from Halfway Down. She kind of does by getting him to go to therapy. View from Halfway Down, he just flat out got lucky. But there is very little reason to even call her, of all people. But he needs her to tell him that his life is worth it to keep trying. I mean, he could have called PC. Definitely in LA, hardly ever leaves LA. But he called Diane, and I think that really means something. I'm sure this comes from their similarities too. Bojack meets Diane's family and learns more about her and sees some traits that he has in her. Except she is able to present herself as much more well-adjusted. She might not be, but she does present that way, at least in the first couple seasons. But he kind of idolizes that and immediately puts her on a pedestal. She becomes the kind of model for him, proof that he can get through this gunk that's holding him back. But ultimately, he's just putting a lot of pressure on her to guide him the right way. And Diane doesn't really want any of that. She definitely wanted to meet him and become friends at least, shown at the Halloween party in 2009, but when we meet her again in 2014, she is all business, likely because of the embarrassment she suffered, but still. She introduces herself professionally, tries to keep Bojack at an arm's length for the first part of season 1, and directly pushes him away when he asks for more. And you can always tell how uncomfortable she is when he puts her in that position. At the book signing, a lot of people blame her for not telling Bojack he's good in public. But honestly, she was so caught off guard. I don't blame her at all for freezing up. I mean, putting someone on the spot like that in front of a crowd is kind of a selfish move. Puts all the pressure on her to lift him up, and it makes her seem like the bitch for not comforting him, even though that's not her job. And it's the same in season 5 when Bojack takes Filbert as a way to accept and come to terms with his own behavior. She doesn't want that.
I made him more vulnerable, and that made him more likable, which makes for a better TV show, but if Filbert is just a way to help dumb assholes rationalize their own awful behavior, well, I'm sorry, but we can't put this out there.
She never wanted to be the person that goes around making toxic personalities feel better about themselves. She doesn't like herself, and she wants to change, but feels she can't. And she doesn't want to help other people who are a little bit like her rationalize the parts of her she doesn't like. But Bojack kind of wants to use her for the opposite reason of that, which definitely rubs her the wrong way and is a huge reason why they can't get along. And I think all of these combined, I mean, obviously the call in View from Halfway Down was the breaking point, but all of this combines into why Diane needs to distance herself severely from Bojack at the end of the show. They just can't be in each other's lives. I think that is the healthiest decision for the both of them, and I truly hope that the both of them can do better on their own, because when they are together, they tend to disagree, and it leads to loud arguments. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and leaving a like down below. I really appreciate all the support you guys give me. If you want to support us further, though, go to patreon.com/PosiTVty, that's PosiTVty. There you can get all these videos early. I'm considering posting the unedited drafts of these videos on Patreon so they can get up there super early, and then you can get to hear all of my wonderful mistakes that I edit out, but you get to hear every embarrassment. So I don't know, check out Patreon if you want some extra content. But anyway, I will see you guys for the next one. Let me know what you'd like to see in the comments, whether it be Bojack or any other show you enjoy. I would love to cover anything as long as I've watched it. I can't promise I've seen everything though, but I will try. And I'll see you guys for the next video. I think this one was remarkably well composed. Lots of mistakes, but I powered through. I mean, you guys should give me credit, people who watched to the end of the video. By the way, I give you credit. Thanks. Y'all are pretty cool. I mean, yeah, just thanks. See you next time.